ICQ Podcast episode 377, On the Cusp of a Scientific Revolution. Well, hello fellow amateur ham radio enthusiasts, and welcome to this, our 377th episode of the ICQ Amateur Ham Radio Podcast, supported this episode by our monthly and annual subscription donors. In this episode, Martin M1MRB is joined by Frank Kilo4 Foxtrot Mike Hotel, Edmund Mike 0 Mike November Golf, and Ed DD5 Lima Papa to discuss the latest amateur ham radio news. Myself, Colin M6BRY, rounds up the news in brief, and this episode's feature is we look at the cusp of a scientific revolution. Well, as always, it's your very kind support that keeps your ICQ podcast running and in your downloads for you every fortnight. And this episode, we'd like to thank our monthly and annual subscription donors for their very kind support to us. As always, if you find value in our show, it's a very simple thing we ask you to do, is to visit icqpodcast.com/donate, turn that value you found from our show into a monetary figure, and pop it along our way, as they to help us for our running costs and pay our way on the internet. Right, we're going to start showing some of that value by joining Martin, Frank, Edmund and Ed to discuss and generate thoughts about the latest amateur ham radio news, including ham skills at field day and wireless power at 10 gigs. As always, hope you enjoy.
The ICQ Amateur Ham Radio Podcast, serving the amateur ham radio community fortnightly since 2008.
Well, hi guys, welcome to the News Roundtable for episode 377 of the ICQ podcast. Tonight, a little bit of a change, but I have Mr. Frank Howell K4FMH with me. Hi Frank.
Hey Martin, and I'm delighted to be here, sort of pinch hitting for Dan Romanchik. I thought about airing a little recording of a squeaky chair for our longtime listeners would remember that Dan had a squeaky chair in his office, but I just didn't get around to it. But glad to be here.
Yeah, good to have you, Frank. And yeah, Dan's having to do his day job while we're recording this, and he's down at Dayton setting up and getting ready for Dayton. So, Dan, enjoy yourself when you hear this. I know Dan is also doing a lecture down there, so a number of you will have seen him anyway when you're down there. We also have Mr. Ed Durrant, DD5LP, over there in Germany. Hi, Ed.
Hi, Martin. Hi, Frank. Hi, Edmund. Yeah, great to be on again. And good luck to everybody that's listening that's either on the way to or just returning from whatever date, and I hope you enjoyed it.
And you mentioned we have our Edmund. We also have Edmund over here in the UK with me, Mr. Edmund Spicer, M0MMG. Hi, Edmund.
Hello, Martin. Hello, everybody.
Hey, mate. It's good to have you on. Right, before we get started on the news stories, I'm going to mention something. This is a bit out of the ordinary, but the feature on this episode runs for the best part of an hour. It's an interview with Frank and Scott McIntosh regarding the sunspots and the sunspot cycles and all those sort of things, and his work he's been doing, which is proving the establishment have been wrong for years. Now, in fairness, you won't get it on listening to it once. I've listened to it a couple of times. I probably need to listen to it at least once more. There's a lot of interesting stuff if you just listen. I think it's well worth the time you're going to spend because it totally blows away some of the theories we've all had and all believe. So, that's about right, isn't it, Frank?
It is, and anytime you have something that's complex, the challenge is to be able to explain it simply. I think that's a quote from Albert Einstein. When you can explain it to your grandmother, you understand it. Listeners may remember I interviewed Dr. McIntosh, Scott McIntosh, about a year ago or so here on the podcast. And he and I hit it off, and we've actually collaborated on a paper that will be appearing in RadCom the July issue, and Elaine Richards, the editor there, may split it into two issues. I'm not certain, but July is the target issue. And what Scott said I kind of contributed to it is my background as an editor-in-chief at a large scientific publisher. Plus, I taught philosophy of science and how science changes. And we've kind of collaborated to help set the stage for what's going on. And Martin, I'll give this away now. 100 years ago, some young whippersnapper named Albert Einstein was challenging Sir Isaac Newton on some of Newton's theories. And Albert Einstein had just published what came to be just an incredibly famous paper on the theory of relativity. One part of it could be tested with a certain eclipse of the sun. The Royal Society over in the United Kingdom funded an expedition to Brazil and the island of Principia to collect 2 photo plates to be able to see if Einstein's prediction was correct or if Newton was correct. In the article, I say, who now reads Newton for science rather than history? Well, what's that got to do with sunspots? Well, in smaller terms of science, what Scott McIntosh and his team have proposed is in clear contrast to what the NASA NOAA team has provided as official sunspot predictions. And we're now waiting to see who's right. So that interview will detail some of that, and we try to put it in a framework that amateurs can follow, although, as Martin said, sometimes listening to something twice is helpful. We all are concerned about sunspots, how many, when cycles are going to change, and things like that. And for the first time, McIntosh and his team have an actual theory. NASA and NOAA don't tell you how they do their official predictions. And so, Martin, I'll kind of leave it there.
Very interesting interview. It's a bit heavier than normal because you're going to have to think. It's, when I tell you about what to look for buying a handy talkie, you can relax a bit and chill. But this one is not to be missed. Right, let's get started with the news stories. 2 students aged 10 and 11 get their ham licenses. Now, there's a couple of young lads in the States, great ambassadors for our hobby, because we keep saying, how are we going to get youngsters into our hobby? But this looks like it actually is happening. I want to let you go first, Frank, on this one.
Well, thank you. And these stories like this where young people get enthused about amateur radio and get licensed, they're always feel-good stories. And this one is no different. And this is in Socorro, New Mexico. And they are at the Cottonwood Valley Charter School. And they were able to be exposed to amateur radio and sort of took off from learning electricity. I want to point out they're in what we in the States call a charter school. Charter schools are a relatively, in the last decade, new concept for public schools. A group proposes a certain curriculum and it goes through a lot of evaluation, and they get public monies to create a school. It's easier to get innovative curricula like amateur radio into a charter school. I've talked to many people who have started them, as well as administrators in public and other private schools. These are public schools. So I just want to bring that out, and that it's a delightful story. And I'll let our other presenters sort of pick up there, but it's certainly a feel-good. 10 and 11-year-old kids, where will they be when they're our age?
I think they'll be the clever ones, Frank, because I know we were both fairly late into the hobby, although we were dabbled for years on other things. But Edmund, what's your thoughts on it?
Well, a good news story, of course, and proof, if it were needed, that it's always good to start people young on these things, because I know from my own experience it is a lot easier, not easy necessarily, but easier to pick things up when you're in your teens than they are when you're several decades older. So good on them, and it's nice to see that they're thinking about future employment, looking to the future, and possibly even helping out at community events. So I hope they will go on to have a long and fulfilling amateur radio career. And even if they go away from it for a while to pursue other interests during their teenage years and beyond, once they've got the license, they can always come back to it later in life. So good news all round, Martin.
Yeah, and one of my sayings is, you can't take the knowledge away from you. Knowledge is great, and you learn so many things. Knowledge will go with you for the rest of your life. Ed, what's your thoughts?
Nothing to add, guys. It's all been covered. I just echo exactly what Edmund and Frank have said.
Well, as I say, we don't hear so many stories from other parts of the world. A lot about people youngsters in the States, but I'm sure, other countries have them. We just don't find out about them. I'm sure you get them in Germany, Ed, the same as we probably get them here in the UK. I don't think we're probably as good at the publicising bit.
Yeah. There was a brother and sister about a year ago, another in Germany, and one about a year before that. About once a year, I think we tend to hear something about youngsters doing well for the community in getting their amateur radio licenses and going on from there. And several of the people in IOTA in Europe are actually out of either Germany or Holland. So they're there, but we don't publicise it very well. That's what I want to come back to you on. I think we probably need to publicise this better than we do.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. So, good on them. Couple of young lads. Great. Come into the hobby. Now, our next news story. Ham radio to show off skills during a field day event. Well, depending on who you are, I would suggest that the US Field Day is probably the biggest event in the calendar. I'm sure that the people at Dayton would disagree with me, but in fairness, there's lots of different ways of taking part in this event. Now, I know this is a US story, so I'm going to give it to Frank again first. But Frank, you say that you do it one way. You go out quiet and just have fun with your friends. Others set up mammoth stations, don't they?
They do, and I've been part of that as well. I think there's a famous video that our friend who has the, I guess, defunct video podcast over from North Carolina, and his name is escaping me, Ham Radio Now, I think it was, had a video called The Last Great Field Day, and it was about the massive field day operations. And at least from my experience in Georgia around the Atlanta area, and then here in Mississippi around the Jackson area, there are groups that do these very large field day operations where we've had cranes at some time, crank up towers. We've had the Red Cross emergency service van, and we probably had 50 to 75 hams. Well, that's great and all that's fine, but many of us, I think George Thomas and Tommy Martin over at Amateur Radio Logic, they kind of ran through that, and very few people actually get to operate. So there's a different style of operating, I think, for most hams who participate. My portable ops team, this year we're going down south of Jackson, down Interstate 55 to Lake Lincoln State Park. We've reserved a cabin. They have one cabin that's sort of off by itself, and for obvious reasons, we reserve that, and we'll put some antennas up, and I've got an experimental 43-foot vertical with an ATU there that I want to test, and we'll go out and operate full battery power with solar charging, and it'll be 5 of us, and some will stay longer than others. But there's a wide variety of styles of doing field day. And this story is one about an Ohio amateur radio service, Portage County in Ohio. And it, kind of a neat story. And I'll let our other presenters pick it up from there. But that's sort of the style of field day as I've observed it here in the States.
Yeah, it does sound an interesting weekend, actually, field day, because I know it starts on one day and goes over to the next. But it sounds like a great time because you do lots of things. Ed, I know that we're in the Europe and you're over there in Germany, but what do you think about Field Day?
Field Day is another name for a ham fest.
Hear, hear.
That's what you'd get from. That's what you'd get from somebody in Australia. The word Field Day has different meanings. Back in the days when I lived in the UK, a field day was a contest. A VHF, UHF field day would be going out and just contesting. The difference with the ARRL field day is that it's as you were saying, so many things to different people, and it's meant to be. It's meant to be publicity for amateur radio. It's meant to be a contest, although it's not officially a contest. It's meant to be somewhere where people can go and try out radio for the first time. It's meant to be social. It's meant to be building clubs. The whole concept and idea of it is it's like the amateur radio hobby itself. It's got such a wide range of things it can include that the local group or club can make it whatever they like. And I think that is actually a very positive thing that the ARRL did when they started Field Day, to make it that broad, and something we could learn from in other countries as well, I think. Yeah, back to you, Martin.
Yeah, I think it always sounds like fun, and I suppose I'd like to be part of it in the States, but that means I've got to stay or have a double trip over after Dayton. But yeah, maybe it does sound like fun. But Ed, you like all these special events, Edmund, and all the other bits and pieces that go with it. And because now the propagation is so much better, I reckon you'll be working lots of stations in the States.
Well, Field Day officially is not a contest. However, my perception, which may not be correct, is that it is a contest in all but name. And I don't do contests ever, with perhaps one exception in recent years.
In which he finished third in the world, I might add.
Yeah, but beginner's luck, Frank, that was.
We were all beginners.
Well, that's right. That's why I didn't take part in the following year, to let somebody else have a go at having a chance of winning it. Anyway, ARRL Field Day is not really something I know very much about, other than some stations can produce some absolutely colossal signals that even I have managed to receive. Last year, June 2021, I found myself still awake and up very late at night by my standards. I'm usually a morning person. I'm not really a night owl at all. But I found myself tuning around 40 meters at about 1 o'clock in the morning local time. And my antenna is relatively low to the ground in wavelength terms. It works very well for contacts into the UK and continental Europe. What it certainly isn't is a DX antenna by any stretch of the imagination. And yet I was receiving Field Day stations from America at 5.9 plus, and if I had transmitted back to them, I'm pretty sure I could have worked them. So I might give it a go this year, Martin, not least because throughout June, amateurs based in the UK can, if they wish, add an extra letter into their call sign, the letter Q for Queen or Quebec. So that would produce some rather unusual call signs for American stations to get into their log. So I might have a go this year. I think the thing that stopped me last year, though, was that I didn't know what information to give. Obviously, I would give my call sign. Obviously, I would give the inevitable 5 and 9 report. But the Field Day stations in the US describe themselves with a letter, with a number and a letter, don't they? Things like 1D and things like that, depending on how many transmitters they have. And how they're powering their operation. So I didn't know if being outside of the US, I would need to work out the equivalent code, or if I would just give something else in my report. And at the risk of putting you on the spot, Frank, as our American representative this episode, do you know the answer to that?
Well, those are special event call signs. And there is a website I discovered while doing some work on the aging contesters in the ARL sweepstakes that sort of saved my bacon, as we might say here in the States, because they have those call signs in a database, and you can look it up, and you can see who the registering call sign is. Like if I had W5W as a registered special event call sign, it would have K4FMH as the person who registered it. So my understanding, Edmund, and listeners can correct me if I'm wrong, that if you work W5W, then you would log it as W5W, because it could have a wide variety of operators there, besides the person such as me who might have registered that call sign. I believe that's correct.
I think the other thing, what Edmund was asking is, he didn't know whether he was a high power station in the field, low power station, multi-ops, and all those things.
Oh, I see.
Edmund, what I'd suggest you do is, if you don't know, if the station wants you and gets you in their log, get them to ask you in plain English, and you tell them, I'm on my own, I have one transmitter, I'm running 100 watts, bang. And they can work it out themselves, because they're getting the points. They'll be happy enough. I
see.
You're not entering the contest though, Edmund, are you?
Yeah.
Correct.
You're not entering the contest, are you, Edmund? So you don't need that. You'll just return DX. So instead of the state, you'd return just DX.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. I just thought I'd ask on behalf of anybody else listening in Europe.
Correct. And yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Martin.
By the way, guys, don't try to work anybody in Central Europe on the ARRL field day, will you? Because it's the same weekend as ham radio in Friedrichshafen.
Ah.
Somebody got the dates a little bit wrong there. Or not wrong, but it's an unfortunate clash. All the big stations will be at Friedrichshafen.
Edmund, I don't know how anybody could ever do that. Can you imagine anybody doing a contest or anything to get it on the same date as another one?
And that's just another reason I stay out of contesting.
Well, I'm talking about the Portable Operations Challenge and our friends in California who got quite upset that our first year was on the weekend of their 50th anniversary.
Yeah, with the calendars, you can't help overcrossing. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Edmund. I was going to throw one last thing in, and I'll get Frank to sort of confirm a little bit on this one. If I get it wrong, that is, you guys in the States, you have the go-to station where new people turn up, they get a go. You run it, you get so many points for having a station, and you demonstrate to the public amateur radio on one thing like another. What I'm going to suggest is, if any of you guys want to run a digital voice that the ICQ podcast runs at the moment, what I'm going to say is, drop us an email at info.icqpodcast.com and tell us you're going to be on, and tell us your go-to station wants to use our set of digital protocols. We can get you on D-Star, DMR, and Fusion, so and any mix of those you like. So, just an offer. If you're going to do it, let me know, so I'll try and make sure I'll let people on here know that you're going to do it. But just a thought, Frank. It might be another way for new people.
It's a brilliant thought, because as we discussed in our rehearsal, sometimes in the doldrums of field day, or if sideband conditions are less than stellar, people have used Echo-Link to repeaters and whatever, but I think doing it with our digital talk group will allow people from outside the states to kind of participate and introduce would-be hams. Remember, that's part of what GOTA is about, is getting non-hams on the air under a control operator. So, Martin, I think that's a brilliant suggestion. I hope some people with GOTA stations will take that in mind and let you know and schedule that. That would be very, very neat.
Yeah, if I can just jump back in and correct something I said before.
Go on.
I've just gone back through the ARRL rules, and at the start, the first paragraph says that people outside of IARU Region 2 cannot enter, except if they do send in a log of abuse as a check log. But going down to the exchange, it says for DX stations, which the Europeans would be for people in the US, they send operating class and the term DX. So, yes, you do have to work out whether you're a 2A, a 1E, a JT, whatever, not a JT, 4F or something. So, yeah, you have to work out. In the majority of times, you're going to be a home station. So that's going to be a Class D. And then how many stations do you have? You've probably only got one, so you're probably 1D, Edmund. But yes, you do need to put that code in, unfortunately, even though you're excluded from the contest by the ARRL rules in the first point, because you're not eligible, because you're not within IARU Region 2.
Roger.
There you go. And as I say, the option is open. If I do know that you want to use the talk group, then I'll let people know, and hopefully you'll get people on. Right, move to our next news story. 10 meters, FM, 3,838 miles. Or for our continental friends, 6,177 kilometers on 29 megs, 10 meters. Ed, what's your thoughts on this one?
Right, well, the first thing I'll say is to all of the listeners, have a look at the text, the script on the website, on the ICQpodcast.com website. There's a link there to the YouTube video of this happening. Go and have a listen to it, or have a watch of it and listen to it. It is just fun to watch. It's obviously freak conditions. Let's hope we get more and more of these. But an FM QSO over 6,000 kilometers on 10 meters, that's going some. And the two stations there, WP4KY and CN8VY, forgetting which countries, Puerto Rico and Morocco in South Africa, in the southern part of Africa. It's not the southern part of Africa, sorry. Morocco in Africa and Puerto Rico in South America, or Puerto Rico is one of the islands, isn't it? Sorry, so Central America. That is one heck of a distance to get on 10-meter FM. Brilliant. As I said, you just go and watch the video on YouTube, and you won't believe it. But it's really nice, and you can tell in the guy's voice. A lot of it's in Spanish, but you can tell by his tone how excited he is. So. Yeah, this links in nicely, I guess, with the fact that propagation's getting better, and maybe we'll understand a bit more why from this time's feature as well. Back to you, Martin.
Yeah, I'll say that's good. Edmund, I know you speak a little bit of Spanish. You're probably going to enjoy this one.
Well, yes, I watched the video, and I must compliment the Moroccan station's grasp of Spanish, first of all. His Castilian Spanish was very good indeed, because in Morocco, if they were going to speak any foreign languages at all, I would have thought French would have been the obvious one, but I understood every word of his Spanish, so that's really good, and encouragement to us all to attempt to try a few words in foreign languages now and again on the air. The response that you get will almost always be very positive, and whilst I'm quite sure that Ed is correct, that the main reason for the excitement in the voice was this contact over that distance using FM, part of the excitement could have been that this chap in Morocco was coming back in in Spanish rather than using English or some other language. And incidentally, if you look on his YouTube channel, there are videos of other simplex contacts on 10 meters in FM, including several with UK stations. I'm not one of them, unfortunately, yet. So that's well worth checking out. FM can work very well in strong signal conditions. And if you watch the video of this contact, yes, it does fade sometimes, but for probably 3/4 of the duration of the clip, the incoming signal strength is S9 plus 20, 40, 60. It's very, very strong. Therefore, I am assuming this is multi-hop sporadic E rather than F2 layer propagation, because broadly speaking, if you have sustained strong signals like that, that is usually more of a hallmark of sporadic E than F2. And now that I've said that, it will probably get proven further down the line that it was F2 propagation all along. But yeah, don't overlook going up the top end of the band. FM does have a couple of advantages. The minor one is the capture effect. So whereas if you were listening on SSB and you had 3 or 4 or 5 stations calling you all at once, you would hear just a noise, and you might get the odd letter here and there. If you have the equivalent thing on FM, then you will hear one station that will make it through, that will capture the frequency above all others. The major advantage with FM on 10 meters is that everybody is listening and transmitting on the same frequency, whereas with CW or SSB, given the size of the 10 meter band, if you're tuning up and down, then somebody could turn up, call CQ, and then disappear again in less time than it would take you to tune across where they were on the band. I know that's less of a problem these days with radios that have waterfall displays, and many radios these days do have waterfall displays, of course, but there are lots and lots out there that don't. So on SSB, yes, you could quite feasibly miss somebody calling CQ, but because 29.6 is like a spot frequency, then everybody is on there who's going to be around. So call CQ, and you might be surprised. It's one of those where if you listen and listen and listen, you probably won't hear anybody call. You probably won't hear anybody else call CQ. But if you call CQ yourself, in my experience on that frequency, you probably stand something like a 50-50 chance of somebody coming back to you or not. You get the same effect on 2 meters, but on 10 meters, I think lots of people listen, but most people wait for somebody else to call CQ first rather than initiating it themselves. And on a similar note to that, if you're in the UK, don't forget 51.510, which is the equivalent frequency on 6 meters, which is also a great band for doing FM on, and it's chronically underused. But well done to both the stations involved in this QSO on 10 meters FM. And yeah, congratulations to them both, and get some activity on there. It's a great band and a great mode.
Yeah, great, Edmund. Frank, have they left you anything to say on this one?
I could give some exclamation points and things like that. And while I do not speak Spanish, I know that if I were one of the operators, I might say some things that Edmund would not be encouraged to translate here on the podcast. But incredible QSO, and the neat thing about going over water is it's just kind of amazing the kinds of things that can happen. So they have certainly my applause and my admiration.
Yeah. Great achievement, guys. Great achievement. And sounds like from your voices, you got the fun of amateur radio, which is what it should be. That was a good one. Right, and next news story, wireless power transmission at 10 gigahertz. I worry about this. Ed tells me that these transmissions were safe. I'm going to let you go first, Ed, but I still feel worried.
Yeah, I didn't say they were safe. I said that the report said that they were within the required limits to be considered safe. I wouldn't want to stand in front of these things running a kilowatt or 1.6 kilowatt on 10 gigs. Yeah, the background of this is it's power transfer using microwaves. At the moment, it's the Navy that's doing it to test on land, so over land. The long-term reason for doing it is they want to transfer power down from satellites, from space. Presumably, you can pick up a lot more power from the sun out the other side of our dirty atmosphere than from within it, and therefore they want to get that power down to Earth. If there's other military uses for it, I don't know, but yeah, those kind of power levels, and apparently previous tests were at a lot higher power levels, where they actually had to have a system in place that would see if something was coming across an aircraft or a bird or something, and turn the transmission off so that it didn't basically fry the bird. But apparently at the 1.6 kilowatt level, they don't legally need to do that. Apparently they say, no, that's the way it's beamed, it's not dangerous. That's what they say in their report. I'm not so sure. But I'm not the expert. Back to you, Martin.
No, I get where you're coming from. I mean, if I understand, my understanding is I'm beaming power, and in this case, a distance of 1 kilometre. And at the far end, you receive 1.6 kilowatts of power that I assume you can rectify or whatever and run a device, let's say. But there are losses in the transmission line and one thing and another. So closer to the transmitter, you might be running 2.5 kilowatts, for argument's sake, and getting losses across the way. I wouldn't want to stand in that beam or even cross it personally, even though it's intrinsically safe, as you put it, Ed. Frank, what's your thoughts on this one?
Well, I share everything that has been said. As I said in our rehearsal, I have unformed but vague concerns. And that doesn't sound very scientific, I know, but I think we all have some of those when we don't know things. And I'm like Ed, I'll take what they're saying at face value. Now, I've actually worked with the Naval Research Laboratory at their Stennis Space Center site here on the coast of Mississippi. I have great respect for NRL. I worked with their bathymetry group, whose acronym is NAVO, and they modeled the world's oceans and that sort of thing. This is an intriguing emergence in terms of experimental research. The transmission of power from space or to space, that sort of thing, builds on this incredible amount of research in beam forming antennas, and their rect antenna, short for rectifying antenna, appears to be, one of the latest things that have been developed. Now, that may have been developed up at MIT at the Haystack laboratory there. They have ham radio operators there. Phil Erickson with the Ham Sci program is located there, for example. So I'm sure this has got a lot of potential. This is kind of a good breakthrough, if you will, or proof of performance and so forth. I'll sit back and wait to see. I wouldn't want to go between the beams. It strikes me as that 1.21 gigawatts of power that was in the movie Back to the Future.
Yeah, they say power levels, it worries me. It worries me. And if the Navy's involved in doing this, I'm going to stick my neck out on the block, because I know you can't, you live in the States, but there's got to be a military reason why they want to do this.
No question.
I would have thought. I'm not asking you to put your neck on the block on that one, Frank. Edmund, what's your thoughts?
I'm of the same mind, Martin. If it's true that you can melt a chocolate bar in your pocket by putting 1 watt into a small dish at 2.4 gigahertz and standing in front of it, and whether that is actually true or just an urban legend, I don't know. But if that's anywhere close to true, then I don't want to be standing anywhere near any of these dishes. I assume they're putting the energy into dishes, and I assume that the dishes are very large to give a very narrow foresight of a beam, rather. But yes, if they're doing that, then I'm staying well out of the way, Martin, for the exact reasons that we've said.
Yeah, I don't think we're being chicken, but yeah, I've just seen.
Martin.
But yes, Frank.
No, it's Ed. Just
yeah.
to throw something else in there, don't forget we have an amateur band on 10 gigahertz as well.
We do.
So I believe the frequencies they used in this test didn't cover the amateur frequencies, but I could see something of this power level somewhere nearby, even if you're not in the beam, sort of the stuff spraying off the side, desensing the band for amateurs.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're only secondary users, so we've got nothing we can complain about, really.
I do know, because I have been out with the Microwave Boys on 10 gigs, and with the gain of the dish and bits and pieces, they put out a fair amount of ERP. So I can't remember exactly what it was. In the old days, they used to use Mark 1 F290s as the IF, and then have a transverter behind the dish.
Yeah.
And I saw some idiot one day lift his dog up and put it in front of the dish, because the guy stopped transmitting instantly, because, general public can be idiots at times. But hey, even with an amateur thing, I wouldn't want to be in front of it deliberately. So that's a good way of looking at it.
Oh, and on a similar note to what Ed said, 10.7 gigahertz is the bottom end of the KU band, which direct broadcast satellites use. So, for example, the Astra 2 constellation that carry Sky programs in the UK, they transmit between 10.7 and 12.75 gigahertz. So there could be potentially scope for interference there as well. So does this mean if I got my Sky dish and stuck it on a tripod, I could get free electricity if I put it somewhere between these two dishes?
I think it would burn your LMB out instantly, Edmund.
Yeah, the other thing is 10.245 gig is the QO100 frequency band as well.
Yeah.
So if they're going to do this from space in the future, we might lose our geostationary satellite.
Or they're playing with 10 gigs at the moment as a red herring to us, and they're going to use something in a completely different band. It might just be that for experimental purposes, it's easier to do what they want to do on 10 gigs and then scale it somewhere else later.
Yeah, because they can get the hardware easier. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're all guesstimating at the moment, so I don't think we'll ever know the truth. Okay, let's move on to our next one. And Frank, you was a busy boy, because you took Rob Sherwood's information and you've produced a number of charts, and you tell me there's more to come, but your website's got the Sherwood tables available now, hasn't it?
It does. I'm calling the set of them the Sherwood tools. Now, I've worked with Rob directly, and he's sort of very positive about it. I wanted to make sure Rob was reviewing what I was doing and make sure I didn't misinterpret any of his work. I've added the market entry price and the EHAM ratings, the year that each transceiver or radio entered the marketplace. So I put those together for a couple of reasons. We've had Rob Sherwood on our podcast twice, as I recall. I did an interview with him along with a follow-up interview with Bob Allison, who was his counterpart at ARL before Bob retired. And I believe you had him back on to talk about transmit quality, which is something he published an article in QST on. He told me privately he was shocked that they published it, that they tended to steer away from that sort of thing. And so Rob, I think as an engineer, has had this table out there for years and has done his best to explain it to people. And he's done a great job. My earlier research was published in the National Contesting Journal, and then some of the talks that I've given, I believe I gave one, Martin, maybe to your club, the Sutton and Sheen Club, but certainly several in England, and I'm scheduled to give another one here soon. I realized that any table of data can be challenging for some people to make sense out of them, including statisticians. So what I've done is tried to take Rob's table, add these other data elements, and then use some data visualization tools to help make sense out of it. Now, the first thing I did was just make a table you could sort on any of his measurements. I kept getting asked that. Plus, you can just download the data directly from Rob's website, but from mine, this is at the foxmikehotel.com website, and you'll see it there on the front page where to go. The Sherwood table in an Excel spreadsheet. So you can take it, you can do whatever you want to with it, you can roll your own and that sort of thing. One of the key issues that many hams get stuck on is they look at the ranking of radios in Rob's table. Well, let's face it. He has to put them in some kind of order. Now, he ranks them on the narrow dynamic range. Well, you can separate out a signal you want to hear from other powerful signals that are close by. Problem with that is that there may not be much of a difference in the actual narrow dynamic range between numbers 3, 4, and 5, but yet they're ranked 3, and then 4 can't be as good, right? It's ranked 4th rather than 3rd, and the same thing with 5. So I've got an illustration of how we can outrank ourselves in looking at that. And again, a number of others. I've got a 3D view where you can spin that around and look that cube, and you can identify radios, the bang for the buck. And I have what I call my golden quadrant, where you've got high-performing, well-liked radios on EHAM at certain price points and that kind of thing. And I'll end with this. I'm finishing a table, a page that has a table and some other data analysis graphics on it to look at premium rigs. Who invented the premium transceiver? Well, it wasn't Hilberling. It may well have been Collins, but I'll tease that for our listeners that by the time this podcast drops, I will probably have that additional web page on the premium HF transceivers from it. And I'll probably add some more stuff as time goes on, Martin.
Well, that sounds interesting, Frank. I know you've done a lot of work on this, so thought I'd bring it to everybody's attention. Edmund, you spend half your life in spreadsheets and numbers and one thing or another. Have you looked at these sheets?
Many apologies to Rob Sherwood if he listens to this. I'm afraid that I haven't, and I don't think I've ever even looked at his website. What a confession. The reason being that I'm not in the market for a new radio, neither today nor in the foreseeable future. And when the time does come, what I buy next will probably be dictated by what people are selling locally or what I can find on a well-known auction site, because I tend to buy second-hand or nearly new rather than brand new. So, again, many apologies to Mr. Sherwood, but I don't think I'm part of his target audience, I'm afraid, Martin.
No, that's very valid. That's very valid. Let's be honest about it. And I did work for one of the dealers in the UK at one point in time. And when you line up, say, 3 manufacturers, one by the side of the other, and they say to me, well, which one's the best? And I said, well, they're all in your price range, sir, or your budget price that you want to pay. They all do pretty much the same thing. There's not, unless you're a serious contester and you're paying serious amounts of money for your radio and you have a hilltop site with a massive antenna, they're pretty much going to do what they all do. And my argument to people was, which one do you like the look of? Because if you're going to sit down in front of a radio that you think is pig ugly, you ain't going to use it. So it comes a point in time where ergonomics and looks have to get you excited to make you want to operate that radio. So performance is a great idea. And Frank, I know that Edmund and I are probably being a bit controversial here, but sometimes you have to just look and go, yeah, for what I'm doing, that's perfectly acceptable. Ed, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, just coming back on a couple of things there. I think Rob Sherwood often says on his standard table, basically anyone in the top 10 or the top 15 is a good radio, and to split them will then depend, as you've said, Martin, on personal preference. I think if you got a local retailer that sells multiple makes and multiple models, and you're looking to buy a brand new radio, your best deal is to sit down and if they'll let you play with each of them, because some of them will have multiple menus that will get on your nerves. Others will have too many buttons. A lot of it actually will also come back to what you're used to. So if you've bought from one manufacturer before and you've been happy with it, but it's now a radio that's 10 or 12 years old and it's time to replace it, you're more than likely going to go to the same manufacturer because you're used to the way it looks and the way it works. Now, the extra things that Frank has done is taken the data from Rob Sherwood and added other data in that comes as almost from people's comments of how much they like something, or and also pricing and such like, and all of that added together gives you a different way to look at the information. And Frank did send an email out to everybody on ICQ, on the ICQ podcast team, and I did go off and have a look. And once I realised I was looking at the wrong website, because Frank's got 2 major websites there, and found my way to the right pages, I just looked at it and went, okay, I'll have a look at this feature or this diagram, shall we say, but I haven't had time to go through all of the different options. And I don't know if I ever will, because I think it's the same as Edmund was saying, when it comes the time to buy another radio, it'll depend on other factors than not just performance. And it may just be local support, for example. So everybody's needs and everybody's measurement as to what is the best radio for them at this point in time is going to be different. Back to you, Martin.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, my argument is, as long as you're happy with the radio you bought, use it. I remember when I worked at the dealers, forget the radio. Well, not even, yes, I remember it, but I'm not going to mention it. There was a radio come out and it was ugly. And it was supposed to be really good. And I couldn't have sat in front of it for more than about 10 minutes without getting bored and walking away. So anyway, there you go. Last news story, English special event. And Edmund hasn't had first go on any of these yet, so I know he's got a cue for his call sign. But Edmund, tell us about this one. And, what's your thoughts on it?
Well, it's not just English. This is available to everybody in the United Kingdom and all license levels as well, foundation, intermediate and full. I'm not an expert on this, by the way, so if anything I say sounds not quite right, I would urge people to check this out rather than just simply taking my word for it. But in June, we're celebrating Her Majesty the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, 70 years on the throne, and I think only Louis XIV of France is a couple of years ahead of her, but certainly in terms of the UK, Queen Elizabeth is by far the longest reigning monarch, and let's face it, nobody, even somebody born today, is not going to see anybody else being on the throne for 70 years in their lifetime. So the achievement, the duration, is worthy of celebration, I think, even if you're not a royalist, or even if you don't like the Queen or the royal family at all. And I'm personally not any great royalist by any means. I haven't got anything against them either, but the duration of it means that I think it's worthy of celebration. So what Ofcom have said is that all UK amateurs can, if they wish, apply for a notice of variation to add the letter Q for Quebec or Queen into their call sign as a regional secondary locator. Now, the application form to do this appears on the RSGB website, but you do not have to be an RSGB member to apply for the notice of variation. Applying for it takes about 2 or 3 minutes. It's free, it's quick, it's easy. So you might as well apply, even if you end up not using it. If you've got it sitting there, then that's an option that's available to you. One slight drawback with using it, however, is that it will obscure your location within the UK just by looking at the call sign on its own. So, for example, my call sign, Mike 0, Mike November Golf, is a full call sign based in England. If I lived in Wales, or if I visited Wales for the day, I would become Mike Whiskey 0. If it were Scotland, it would be Mike 0, Northern Ireland, Mike India 0, and so on. If you use the Q, then the call sign Mike Quebec 0, Mike November Golf could be anywhere in the United Kingdom, and you wouldn't know where it was just from looking at the call sign alone. Being a friendly chap, I would tell you, probably, if you were interested in knowing which country I was in. So presumably as a reaction or a solution to that, Ofcom have also agreed that UK licensees can add a suffix to their call sign of /70. Now, I imagine that the initial thinking was that people would probably use one or the other, because let's face it, Mike Quebec 0, Mike November Golf /70 is a bit of a mouthful, not least if you're sending it on CW rather than just saying it. Nevertheless, it states very clearly on the RSGB website that Ofcom have specifically said that stations can, if they wish, use both at the same time. So in my specific example, Mike Quebec 0, Mike November Golf /70 would be a valid call sign. Personal preference, I'm not going to use the /70 for the reason that I've just mentioned. In my opinion, it would make the call sign rather long and unwieldy. My understanding is that if you plan on simply using the /70, but not the Quebec, then there is no requirement for you to apply for the notice of variation. Although, as I've already said, seeing as it is a free and quick and easy process that will take you about 3 minutes, frankly, you might as well apply for it, even if you have next to no intention of using it. I've looked at the notice of variation that was sent to me, and all it talks about is varying the call sign and nothing else. It doesn't mention the /70 thing at all. Therefore, I am as certain as I can be, without being an expert, as I emphasize again, that if all you want to do is use /70, then you do not need to apply for a notice of variation. And that's everything I know, I think. And I plan to be very active during the month, including on the ICQ podcast talk group and including over the ARRL Field Day weekend. So I might even give a few points away, Martin, even though I don't do contests. Back to you.
Yeah, that's fine. I know you don't do contests, but Frank has the Frank has your log, mate. You can't get away from it. Ed, I'll bring you in last on this one, Frank. But Ed, what's your thoughts on this one?
Well, I'd just like to thank Edmund for a very clear explanation of what's going on. I think that was very well done. Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking also with the really long call sign there, the MQ5 ABC /70 probably won't work in the digital data modes. There's restrictions on what you can put into the digital fields on several modes, not just FT8, but also other data modes. You may well have problems trying to use that extended call sign. But it'll be good to hear some different call signs on. And I'm not sure about contests in June, not just Field Day, but other contests, whether the call sign with the Q in then counts as a different DXCC effectively, or a different multiplier, not DXCC, a different multiplier for people in contests. It might do, in which case fine. And anything we can do to celebrate a very special lady who has done an awful lot for her country, who got dropped into that role at a very young age, and that most, if not all, other countries in the world are jealous that they don't have somebody similar. I'd like to wish a very good and healthy Jubilee to Her Majesty Elizabeth II. Long may her reign continue, and it's never going to happen again. We're going to have somebody in that length of reign, I think, is honest, an honest statement. And she's done an extremely good job and been a very special person to many, many people as well. Okay, back to you again, Martin.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you on that. As 100%. I think the Queen has worked very hard for the UK. She's a lovely lady and gets my support. So on that one. Frank, I know that this is a UK-centric story and one thing and another, but you might be able to work a few MQs. Who knows? You might get Edmund and me yet.
It could be, and I will say that I have ancestors that are from Leicester as well as Lancaster. So I are one back in my family tree. And I will echo both Ed and your comments, as well as Edmund's. The biographies and what I've read and things that have been done, with integrity on the biography of Queen Elizabeth and the family and the context. She's an amazing person, and she's been an amazing leader who has literally given her life to the country. It's said in the U.S. that being president is certainly a life-changing event. And for the men involved in being the president of the U.S., you always watch their hair turn gray while they're in office. So imagine being the Queen of England for 7 decades, through thick and thin, wars, good times, not so good times. She's certainly quite deserving. And so it'd be an honor to work anyone there, and maybe even you two guys.
Well, we hope to get on, Frank. That's it. Right, that concludes our news stories. It's run a little bit long this time, but I'm going to ask the guys what they've been up to since the last time we had a chat. Let's go with Ed first. What have you been up to, Ed?
Okay, I'll keep it short. I've got a list here, but I'll keep it short. I've been very busy in the summit activations, but not just SOTA. 3 different award schemes, SOTA, HEMA, and also GMA. I've been surveying new regions for HEMA, HEMA, to get them in place in time for people travelling down next month to ham radio in Friedrichshafen. I enjoyed attending the ICQ meetup on DMR last Saturday. Joined in there a couple of times. Nice to talk to the listeners that did get to call in. What else am I doing? On hardware project-wise, I've designed and I'm experimenting with a very simple HF pre-selector that anyone can build to use with SDR rigs that have no analog front end in them, such as the IC 7300. And I'm actually finding it brings improvements when trying to pull in weak signals out of the noise. So I'm actually quite amazed at what a simple circuit can do there. I'll be publishing something on that somewhere on the blog, probably. The last thing on the list is I've been doing some software testing of a piece of software that I covered as a feature a couple of years ago on ICQ podcast, Pocket RxTX, and it's now version 4, or it will be. It's still in testing. It's an Android app that is a remote control application for amateur radio rigs, and also a client for the web SDR websites. So lots of different things in different areas. Very busy over the last 4 weeks, and enjoying it. So back to you, Martin.
Yeah, sounds like you've been really busy, Ed. And as I say, we did speak last Saturday on the talk group, and it was great fun. Edmund, what have you been up to?
I enjoyed taking part in the ICQ podcast activity day. It was really nice to talk to several of our listeners. And I had a small, I was going to say problem, that's too strong a word, with my Pi-Star hotspot. It worked fine, but I couldn't get my Windows laptop to talk to it to update the software. There can be gaps of weeks or several weeks sometimes between me going on to the talk group. So I don't have my hotspot switched on 24 hours a day, especially not with all the talk in the news recently about vampire devices that ramp up your electricity bill by being switched on, when you're not using them. So I tried to access the dashboard to update the software, but several different laptops that I tried it on said that the hotspot was not responding. And I thought, oh no, maybe this means it will be forever locked onto the ICQ podcast talk group and I'll never be able to go on to something like Freestar or something like that. So I left it powered up overnight because these devices update themselves automatically in the wee small hours. The other thing I did early on the Sunday morning was switch my router off for a couple of minutes and then turn it back on again. The idea to do that didn't occur to me until the Sunday morning, but even if I'd thought of it on the Saturday, I wouldn't have done it until Sunday morning because I would have probably got howls of protest from the other people who live in the house here that I'd cut their internet off, whereas on the Sunday morning I was the first person up long before anybody else. But those two things between them meant that I was able to access the dashboard again, and I wasn't getting the your hotspot is taking too long to respond type error messages. And that's possibly a tip if anybody out there has had something similar happen. And it didn't matter if I was using the links saved in my favorites or if I typed in the IP address directly into the browser with or without /admin at the end of it. Everything I tried made no difference until I left the thing switched on overnight. Looking forward, as mentioned, planning to be active, or a lot more active during the whole of the month of June for the Platinum Jubilee. And a web page that's worth looking at, incidentally, is rsgb.org/Jubilee. If you go there, that takes you to like an index page with about half a dozen hyperlinks on to other pages relating to the Jubilee. On the index page, there are no last updated dates, and I looked at that index page back in April, a good number of weeks ago now, and then I looked at it again a few days ago, and by looking at that index page alone, it looked like nothing at all had changed in the meantime. And it was only when I clicked on the individual links to then go onwards to the different subject pages that I realised that some of them had actually been updated. So don't make the same mistake that I did. Click on the links and look at the actual pages to see if there's been any recent updates. Does that make any sense at all, Martin?
Certainly does. A lot of websites do get updated, but the biggest problem with most websites out there is they never put the date they published, which is a real shame. It's something I try and do on the website pages I'm responsible for on the ICQ podcast site.
Okay.
Okay, but well, that sounds like you had some fun and done quite a bit. Frank, what have you been up to while we've been away?
Martin, I've been over a 2-week period since I'm filling in on the alternate team this time. Obviously been spending a fair amount of time programming, designing the Sherwood tools on my Fox Mike Hotel website. Still doing some work on that just prior to our startup of this podcast episode recording. My partner in my portable operations team, Mike N5DU, and I are planning to participate in the ARL digital contest that comes up the first week in June. ARL has done some reorganization to sort of officially recognize digital mode to go along with their sideband and CW contest. So I've been nattering about trying to figure out whether I'll use my IC705 as QRP radio for that, or if I'll go into higher operating class with my 100-watt FT891. Some of the little niggling features of the 891 involving the ALC I've been trying to get smoothed out to work with WSJTX. It's a mini splendid thing to have all these groups, IO groups, and the FT891 one is a very good one, but if you ask 5 hams, they will set up their FT891 in at least 5 different ways. So I'll get that sorted out, and I'll repackage my 891 in a small Gator case to protect it. But getting plans for that, finishing out the last changes to an article that will be in CQ Magazine's June issue, what they call their Get to the Field or Field Day issue. It's on the Australian company's VK Amps high HF bandpass filter, and I've built that out into a box and done some tests on it and written that up so that the reader can make a decision between should they buy or build. And that, again, that'll be in a CQ Magazine June issue. So that's about it for me for the last 2 weeks, Martin.
Well, sounds like you've been busy as always, Frank, and I think we all get busy. Well, I'm going to just rattle through what I've been up to. A number of you guys have heard me talk about Ham Shack Hotline, which is not really much to do with the amateur radio, apart from it's a VoIP phone system that interconnects amateur radio operators. You have to be an amateur radio operator to be issued a phone number on this VoIP system, and it is free. Unfortunately, 2 of the servers have gone offline. They were down, and it looks like they've gone offline, and the guys are re-provisioning. So I know people down in Australia are offline at the moment, or the Pacific Rim, and people like me that didn't have a Cisco phone, but the experimental server's been down, and they're moving us onto new servers at the moment. and it could take another 2 weeks. It's been out about 3. Potentially, there's another 2 weeks before we get Ham Shack Hotline back for some of us. Some of you have not been affected, to be honest about this. Something we'll do. Oscar Wood, 2 Echo 1 Hotel Whiskey Echo, dropped me a line today saying he's organising Gateways on the Air, and he's running this between the 11th and the 17th of June. And we're going to try and get hold of him and find out a little bit more about it. But he dropped me a line saying that was happening. The activity day, the ICQ podcast digital activity day, after 12 hours, I was pretty wrecked, but thoroughly happy and enjoyed. Didn't get as many people join as I would have hoped. A lot of the regulars, some of those didn't show up, and a lot of regulars did show up. However, a couple of things happened. We had 7 countries. We only had 21 people apart from me, but it wasn't a just log in, give your call sign and disappear. The guys were chatting on and off all day, and somebody would call in and then they'd have a chat with another user and us, and then they'd disappear off and come back about an hour later, and because they've been doing things around the house. And so the whole day, the whole 12 hours was pretty much, not much more than 10 minutes of quiet time within the whole day on the talk group, because people were asking questions and all sorts of things. Now, in the UK, one of the listeners, Andy, and I apologise, set up, because I can't remember your call sign, but Andy set up GB7WR in the Malvern Hills, and that was connected to our system. And I spoke to him a couple of times, and he said his repeater was busy, the busiest he's ever been, and he was thoroughly enjoying it. And the first user I worked was another repeater keeper on Andy's repeater, a guy called Alan, and I've worked Alan a few more times over the last couple of days, and he's actually got a couple of DMR repeaters connected to our talk group. So you may very well hear people that are not sure who the ICQ podcast are, but be polite to them. They're amateurs, and welcome them into the fold. Now, as I say, I think we may get a few more doing that. And for those of you who had a little bit of problems operating me a couple of times during the day, one of my hotspots died about 11 hours into the day, and I thought it was going to be expensive for the way it went, but never judge a cover by its book. Don't panic, wait and look at it logically. And what had happened is the SD card had failed, and it was a failure on the SD card. So a new SD card in it, and it's up and working again. And what I will say is, for those of you who don't know, because I've spent quite a bit of time talking to Andy Taylor for PyStar, the man who wrote PyStar. PyStar has a lot of very, very, very useful facilities that do try and solve a lot of these problems for you before they happen. For argument's sake, you probably didn't know, but the PyStar operating system, once your Raspberry Pi is booted up, it's booted up, and the file system is then read-only. So if you lose power or you just pull the power out, you don't corrupt the SD card. Another thing is, and I keep saying, updates happen. Overnight, updates will happen on your PyStar. And as I say, if you've been in and screwed something up, the update will often fix it. So there's a lot more going on a PyStar box than some of you would know. And I'm not saying stay in ignorance of it, but make sure you do your updates. And that's pretty much where I've got to. So I think we've all been busy. All that's left for me to do is thank you all for joining tonight. I'd like to thank Mr. Frank Howell K4FMH.
Thank you for asking me to fill in for Dan, Martin. Enjoyed it greatly, guys.
Yeah, good to have you, Frank. I'd also like to thank Mr. Edmund Spicer, M0MMG.
Thanks for having me on, Martin. And as I say, I'm a bit frazzled after 2 very long days at work. So if I make even less sense than usual, or if I was rambling a bit, then I apologise.
No problems. You're okay. We'll be okay. Don't worry about that. And also, last but not least, I'd like to thank Mr. Durrant, DD5LP, for joining us from Germany.
Thanks for the invite as always, Martin.
Yeah, great to have you, mate. No problems at all. Okay, all that's left for me to do is say 73s to you all, and we'll continue with the podcast. 73, guys.
73.
73.
7-3.
Keep your amateur ham radio podcast advert free by donating less than a length of coax. Visit www.icqpodcast.com/donate now. For all the news, links and information, visit www.icqpodcast.com.
And now it's time to have a look at the news in brief with me, Colin M6BOY. We start off with news and congratulations that the chairman of the ARRL's RF Safety Committee, Gregory D. Lapen, November 9, Golf Lima, will receive an award at this year's Data and Hamvention from the Radio Society of the UK, Radio Society of Great Britain, sorry. He received the Founders Trophy, recognising outstanding service to the Society. And as I say, along with his membership of both organisations, he's formed the EMC Oversight Group, which has been meeting since August 2020 to help develop tools and procedures for complying with the new RF exposure regulations for amateur operators in the UK. The new rules in the UK symptoms already affect in the United Kingdom, so congratulations to Gregory. Heil have announced that they've rebranded their ham radio division. It's in line with their recent changes to their pro division. And they basically have done this based upon the feedback of customers for the ham radio division that wanted a dedicated group for the ham radio customers in their own right. The company have launched a new logo for the Heil radio division, along with a revamped website and a look from there. So you can find out more information about this at heilhamradio.com. And we finish up the news in brief section with news that the Commonwealth Games will take place this summer in Birmingham. And not only is there 4,500 athletes from 72 nations and territories competing across 19 sports and 14 venues, but there's also a planned amateur radio events, special event stations, social gatherings, etc. That you can get involved in. There's also a couple of operating awards you can also find out about. We'll put a link to that on the ICQ podcast webpage if you'd find out more information, as I say, where you can get involved this summer in the Commonwealth Games activities. Right, now we head over to our features episode, which is On the Cusp of a Scientific Revolution. Hope you enjoy.
And now what you've all been waiting for, this episode's feature from the ICQ podcast. Well, hi guys, for this feature, I really got some interesting people for you to talk to. The first person you'll know quite well is our Frank K4FMH is with me. Hi, Frank.
Good morning or evening or middle of the night, depending on where you are and when you listen to this.
It almost was the middle of the night, Frank, for you when we were going to record this, but no problems. It's sorted. And guys, if you've been listening to the podcast for a long time, episode 323, Frank interviewed Scott McIntosh. And Scott is with us today because Scott's predictions for the Sunspot cycles are coming true, as we thought they would. So, hi, Scott.
Hey, good morning, Martin. Good morning, Frank.
Good morning.
Yeah. So, Frank, you've just written a new paper, which is going to get published in Radcom fairly soon. Do you want to tell us what you and Scott have been up to?
Sure, be happy to do it. Scott and I met during that interview, and we sort of hit it off both intellectually and personally. Now, I'm a statistician and social scientist, and he's a solar physicist. And so I think that was sort of an intellectual marriage that is proving to be a good one for understanding the context of what I call the Macintosh team, because he has a group of other a very prominent scientist working with him. And we kept talking about this and the struggles that he was having and his team was having to get journal reviewers to accept their findings. And we began there. I spent a number of years, as many of our listeners know, teaching statistics, research design, philosophy of science. And what this represents is a classic situation where you have two theoretical paradigms that are in conflict, and there is a natural history about that. So Scott and I thought, well, we need to lay this out so that the solar physics, as it is put in a context of institutional science. And so we both worked together, and we've both written this paper, and the title is On the Cusp of a Scientific Revolution, a New Paradigm and Model for Understanding the Solar Sunspot Cycle. Now, Scott's the meat and potatoes here. I'm just kind of the shade tree scientist who's laying out, some of the institutional things. And so what you have today, and I'll begin at Scott with this, and then Martin may want to come to you. A century ago, this young whippersnapper scientist that we all know as Albert Einstein, and his theory of relativity had one principle that talked about light bending. And he said, if we just had plates, photographic plates from two different locations, so we have some perspective, when a certain type of solar eclipse happens, then we could test whether my idea is a good one or Newton is correct. And so a century ago, the Royal Society in England sponsored the travels out to Brazil and the island of Principia to collect these photographic plates. And so there was a time given travel during the day by boat where it said in the London Times and New York Times, the literate world awaits the photographic plates to see who's right. And I think we all know who proved to be right. As I put in our paper, who now reads Newton for science except for history. And so today the Macintosh team has an actual theory, not just a committee that comes up and says, we think this is going to be what happens. And so when I interviewed Scott, little bells went off and I went, these guys have a better mousetrap. They have a new explicit theory. They're publishing this out in peer-reviewed journal, and they've got all the data that they can possibly get going back through time on Sunspot. So now we have the same thing we had a century ago. There's a website that's counting sunspots, putting the Macintosh team predictions and the NASA NOAA official predictions. We need to bow down and wave at that because they're kind of taken as the canon, as the Royal Church's idea. And guess who's winning? It's the Macintosh team. So that's the context, Martin, of how Scott and I got together. And we now have this paper that we're very honored to have Radcom publish in their July issue.
Yeah, that's great, Frank. That's really great. And I suppose it's very difficult because, and this is aimed at Scott here, if you come up with a new theory or a new way of doing things, often you must come up against a massive brick wall of people going, no, it's always been done this way, And I suppose they had the same problem with the Flat Earth Society and things like that. But Scott, tell us about your theories.
Oh, gosh. And thanks, Frank, for that intro. I mean, it's been truly weird, right? Because, and what I'm beginning to realize over time is that the anti-aircraft fire gets heaviest when you're over the target. It's so, I think that's an old adage. And a lot of, I'll go back over what we found, but like the last decade or so as we've been working on this is becoming increasingly difficult as it's gained more and more traction and been kind of observationally verified too. So it all goes back to, I think 2002, I was a young postdoctoral researcher at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. I was in charge of a couple of instruments on the SOHO spacecraft. It's the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory. And my boss at the time, who had survived the first passage of this data, as I'll get to in a minute. So this hypothesis, the observational trail of breadcrumbs that we found wasn't new. But we didn't know that it wasn't new. But my boss at the time did know that it wasn't new, but he just didn't decide to tell me. He wanted to see what we found. And so he asked me to start using our Extreme Ultraviolet telescope, which is called EIT, which is still operational now. It was launched in 1996 and still cranking out images. They're not the highest fidelity things now compared to the 4K cameras that we've got out there, but it's still cranking away. When he asked me to use the data from that to identify these small, very bright features. And if there's one thing you'll learn about solar physicists, we're very, I can't think of the right word to say, but when it comes to describing things, we're very, very descriptive. So these are called EUV bright points because they're bright in EUV images, right? There's no more context to that. It's like seeing those of you familiar with looking at EUV images of the sun will think a coronal hole and say, oh yes, that's literally a hole in the corona, right? So that's the kind of depth of intelligence being applied here. So I developed a little algorithm to go in and pull these tiny features out. Now, by tiny on the sun, I mean these things are a few, tens of thousands of kilometers across. They live for 24 to 48 hours, sometimes longer than that. But because we're snapping images, we were snapping images every 12 minutes or so, my algorithm could go in and find them all in almost, I wouldn't say real time, but it takes about a minute to run. And we started accruing observations. So if I just kind of fast forward, so developed all the framework to store these things, started looking at them probably about 5 years later, believe it or not. We published a paper on our technique and all kinds of other things. The first hints of what we were going to find were in there, but I kept cranking. So by this time I had moved away from Goddard, but I was still running my experiment, right? So this is how it kind of works. So I got to a point where now we're in 2010, 2011, and I noticed something really weird when I was looking at the output. I noticed that the bands, so for those of you that are familiar with looking at sunspots, and looking at what we call the butterfly diagram, which was established by Maunder back in the last century, well, actually the last century, if you plot the progression of sunspots as a function of time and their latitude, it roughly forms the shape of a butterfly's wings. But what we noticed in this data, the analysis of these EUV breakpoints, was that the butterflies started to really overlap. And the overlapping in latitude and time of these bands of EUV breakpoints was going back something more like 6 years back. So what I mean by that is that again, back to the sunspot butterfly diagram, it's very abrupt. So like the start of the butterfly's wings is about 30 degrees latitude, and it seems to snap in when the last set of spots from the previous sunspot cycle disappeared a few years ago. And so it's like a discontinuous function, right? There's two clearly separate butterflies. But when you start to add this other data in, Martin, it gets to the point now where there's 6 or 7 years of overlap between these two butterflies. So they're not really discombobulated anymore. They're overlapping one another. And then we kept watching, and through 2011, we noticed something really weird. That the band, the set of these butterflies at the equator just suddenly stopped. And as it suddenly stopped, activity sprung to life on the mid-latitudes, and it wasn't just a little band of breakpoints anymore. It was the next sunspot cycle. It was cycle 24. And so we started scratching our heads. What were we seeing? And kind of getting a bit giddy about what we were seeing. So that event that we saw late in 2011, I was actually preparing for an eclipse expedition for the upcoming year, and we were working on this too. So that event became called the Terminator, for what it's worth. So I mean, so we get to there. We talk about the Terminator. We've met the Terminator now, and so and all the interesting memes and funny things you can do with that. And we scratched our heads, and I literally had a bathtub eureka moment that the overlapping of we weren't just seeing the butterfly diagram, we weren't just seeing the progression of sunspots, but we were seeing something more. So I dug into the data and started looking at more, and what I found was kind of astonishing. So I won't get into all the details, but we also identified that these EUV breakpoints were tied to a specific scale of the sun's magnetic field, right? So a very small scale, about 30 megameters or 30,000 meters across, that maybe had been hypothesized before, but nobody had ever been able to identify. So it turned out that this so-called giant scale of circulation was where these breakpoints tended to form. And for the longest time, they talked about this giant scale of circulation as being very deep. In other words, it went kind of all the way. It was a circulation pattern or a convection pattern that went all the way down to the base of the sun's convection zone. So that goes down, in principle, about 30% of the depth of the solar interior. So when we started tracking that magnetic scale, in addition to the EUV breakpoints, our overlapping pattern got worse. It went back even further in time into even higher latitudes. So now we're back almost 10 years, and we're now at 55 degrees latitude, where we kind of hit a brick wall. In other words, at 55 degrees latitude, we start to see other patterns develop. And so things start to get really, we at the time we talked about Howard Carter peeking into Tutankhamun's tomb, right? And a lot of amazing things that we were starting to see. So we bring it back up now. So we've now analyzed many terabytes of data. We have this pattern now going back to 1996, and this set of overlapping, basically clearly magnetic systems. And it dawned on me that this was actually the Heil cycle that we were seeing, and so called after George Ellery Hale, who was like the godfather of solar physics and in large part astrophysics. And the Heil cycles, the eponymous Heil cycle, because he discovered that back again about a century ago, that the sun's magnetic field reversed polarity every 22 and a bit years. And so what we were seeing was we were seeing the manifestation of the Heil cycle in the data. Now, there's one thing that we didn't have, and we've only recently managed to find, and I'm kind of jumping the gun a bit, but one of the prevailing calls against our team and our work is that we don't directly see this manifestation in the data, right? So in the magnetic data. So we have these things called magnetograms that measure the magnetic field of the sun. Well, just so happens that our colleagues at Stanford have been measuring that exact same field for something like 35 to 40 years. And so, serendipitously, a few months ago, we got together and wrote a paper because now we can combine their analysis with our analysis. And so, basically, now we can confirm that we were seeing the Heil cycle. And it was the Heil cycle was somehow the overlapping of these Heil cycle bands was acting to kind of form a kind of interference pattern, if you like, because magnetic fields love to cancel each other. And that was resulting in the production of the sunspot cycle. And that's the kind of eureka moment we had back in 2011, that somehow this overlapping cycle was able to, that as the bands came and went and cancelled and disappeared, it modulated the appearance of sunspots on the disk. So in other words, the sunspot cycle is just the output of an interference pattern, right?
But Scott, let me interject one little thing, because hams will I hope get this point. And Martin, for years since Schwabe back in the 1800s began looking at sunspot cycles and kind of plotting them, and says, they seem to go up and down on about 11-year cycle. Let's call this the sunspot cycle. And hams, following what then became solar physics, we're just following. We go, we're not worthy. This is sunspot cycle. It's its own thing. It's been this way for eons and eons. Nothing can change it. We just watch it. So there's a bit of that type of mentality in the reigning paradigm. Well, what Scott's team has documented, and Scott, correct me if I get out too far off the main street here. Wait a minute. It's part of a bigger cycle. Remember, when we take our exams, we talk about electromagnetic waves. Well, the magnetics of the sun seems to, and they're trying to work out how, and that's kind of maybe the next phase, it seems to shape the sunspot cycle, if we call that the number of sunspots from low to high. So that's number one. Scott's team has identified through this terminator event that we're looking in the wrong place. Those are not the droids you should be looking for, as in the highest number of sunspots or the lowest. That's not the real trigger mechanism. When the terminator event happens, that's the trigger mechanism. So think about in the future where Scott's team or some other people have discount the prediction not of sunspots at the low or high or when they turn back up, but how many days till the terminator event? It's moving. The parking lot at certain latitudes, it's moving down. That's where the action's going to be for hams to begin to look. And as Scott and his team have pointed out, looking at the low number of sunspots is not the ticket to truly understand it. Scott, have I screwed that up too badly?
No, that's it. And you gave me a good intro, Frank, to be honest, that, sunspot minimum, or that progression through zero, right, is exactly the time when these bands of the Heil cycle are just mutually cancelling one another, right? So it's always a lot easier to look at this kind of graphically. But you've got four interweaving, oppositely magnetic polarized bands within 35 degrees of the solar equator during the time at which the sun makes no spots, right? That's hardly a minimum energy configuration. It just means that the whole system is cancelling itself. So basically, the terminator event, which comes, a year and a half to 2 years after that sunspot minimum, is the thing that really kicks things off, because now you no longer have four bands. You're back to two again, because two of them have cancelled. And the growth on the two at mid-latitudes is rampant. And, jumping the gun, that's what we saw in December. So if you've noticed the steady increase in the solar radial flux, the minute the monthly value crossed 90, there's no turning back, because that, interestingly enough, is also a signature of the terminator event.
So Martin, part of it is, this is why I said there's a better mousetrap here. They actually have a theory. Now, no scientific theory is complete. There's never been one. Certainly Einstein's was not, although Einstein's holding up well, for 100 years. But theories are always in motion. And that's why in our paper, we outline the work by the physicist and philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, in his book that was published in the early 60s, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. How is it that scientific paradigms change? unlike what I call the white lab coat view of science, where scientists get together and they just kind of go, yes, I think it's time that we change our thinking about this. Oh,
you mean the collective chin scratching?
It doesn't happen that way. It
the
is
office of navel gazing.
It is almost like the French Revolution, off with their heads. But what happens is this. One of the things, if you'll look at the luminaries in amateur radio, Carl Lucien Schwab over here in the U.S., Steve Nichols Martin over there in the U.K., they will openly say, the transition from one sunspot sine wave, I'll call it that, to another, we kind of don't know when that's going to happen. Gosh, we really don't understand that part. How big the peak's going to be? Oh, that's just like a guessing game at your local pub, But we don't want to go against the reigning canon here. Well, guess what? That little time variation between our plotted sunspot cycle sine wave is what Scott and his team are explaining, and they're saying that that's linked, that is that time differential, and Scott can explain it. I'm like the car salesman. Scott's the mechanic. He can tell you why it's working here.
Yeah, so, I'd put you to sleep in the process.
Well, no, but the difference there when one is going down and when it starts back up again, that's an interesting period that Scott's team is helping give life to, because it's linked to how high the next peak is going to be. And yet we hams see that as maybe all or nothing, and NASA has been the big kahuna, the 800-pound gorilla. And guess what? I used to be a NASA badged official at Stennis Space Center, so I are one, as Pogo would have said. Great organization, have a lot of big computers. NOAA, the same thing. They predict weather, terrestrial weather, and all this. You think NASA NOAA panel, gosh, they've got, to dim the lights when they run these models. Well, actually, no. It's a democratic vote where they come out without any disclosure, without any formal disclosure of how they come up with their predictions, and yet we buy them as hams, lock, stock, and barrel. Because why shouldn't we? We're not astrophysicists. We're just following along. So part of what our best writers in amateur radio say is that, we're going to stick with the reigning paradigm, but yet, boy, we sure don't understand some things about it. And I want to point out to our listeners, that's why I got so excited about Scott and his team's work, is they've got a new theory. And when paradigms change, according to Thomas Kuhn, it's when those little things that don't quite work out, but you just kind of brush them off the table as not worth looking at. Scott's bringing them in and saying, hey, here's kind of why those anomalies happen. And science changes in a revolutionary state when a new theory rushes in and explains all that stuff that you don't want to pay attention to because it doesn't fit the current reigning paradigm. And yet we have to then do like they did with Einstein and Newton. Let's take a look. And if you go to one of Scott's friends and associates at Helio Forecast, HELIOFORECAST.space, and if you Google that, it will come there. You can watch in real time where every month they post the sunspot numbers, and they've got the predictions of NASA NOAA. They've got the average sunspot number as projected out, and then they've got the Macintosh team's predictions. And so what's really important here is that we've been looking at the wrong thing. Those are not the droids you need to be looking for.
So just from my uneducated mind, effectively what you're saying is that Scott and his team have gone in with an open mind to look at the situation and not necessarily just read the textbooks and agreed. They've gone in with an open mind and gone, well, how does this actually work? And had a rummage round and had a look at something else. And sometimes when you have an open mind and you're not constricted by conforming to the masses. So would we right on that, Scott?
Yeah, no, spot on. And this is where it comes back to my old mentor, Joe, right? Remember the guy that I said that he likely knew what we would find? Well, yeah, we've never managed to actually get it out of him that he knew what we would find, right? But then, when we were 90% of the way through writing that first paper, we discovered that we weren't the first ones to find this pattern. And that 30 years before us, a team of observers had found the same pattern, right? So this wasn't new. It had slightly different language, but we reached almost exactly the same conclusions as they did. I just didn't know that work even existed. It's like a dirty secret, right?
And this is Peter Wilson's work, right?
That's right. And when I did a bit more digging and talked to some of my more senior colleagues, they're like, "Yeah, didn't you know that?" Well, that work just kind of disappeared. And Peter Wilson, who's an oceanographer from Australia, kind of fits the same bill that you just described, Martin. He came into the problem, got interested, and explored it from a different perspective, right? From that of an oceanographer, and going, well, how do the large scale flows work on the sun, and why does this pattern look this way? And I'll tell you that first paper, I still have the original version of the first paper that we submitted, and we submitted it to Science, and maybe that was a bad idea. The reviews we got back, the first review we got back basically stated, "I don't believe this. Should not be published in any scientific journal." The end. Right? That was it. That was the scientific substance of the review. Right? So if that just gives you a preview to the next 10 years, right?
Thomas Kuhn called that boundary maintenance.
Boundary maintenance.
You're not from around here intellectually, are you, Scott?
Yeah, well, clearly, right? Clearly. So it was kind of interesting period in time. I ended up getting shingles as a result of the massive data dive I took, because I started, as a result of that initial submission, we basically ended up having to withdraw the paper after about a year of fighting. And I went back and rewrote it 3 times, and in the meantime had analyzed data going back to the early 80s, because that's what I could easily get my hands on. And like I said, the same pattern was appearing over and over again, right? So this wasn't isolated, it wasn't random. I was able to see these termination events in the data, and I was, so my 5-page paper, by the time it was resubmitted later in 2013 to be published in January of 2014, was now 35 pages long, right? And that's actually getting to the point where you're so many new concepts in a paper that people's brains are melting, right? They can barely hold on to one, far less 7 or 8. Because I think as Frank described earlier, it wasn't just one set of anomalies we were finding. It was a whole stream of anomalies. It was like an ocean, and everything was kind of dropping into place, right? And we could make it fit without trying to make it fit, if you know what I mean. It was just falling out of the work. And my experience with physics and math is such that when things go like that, there's usually a kind of core elegance to what you're proposing, right? That if things drop out so neatly without having to work too hard, it's usually the signal that you're kind of on target. And that kind of gets us up to the next series of battles.
Yeah, that sounds like you hit the establishment with the "I don't understand what you're talking about, Scott. Therefore, I'm blowing you out because everybody else says this." And from not in the solar cycle, but let's be honest, guys. When we first started learning about electricity, we all thought that the current flowed from positive to negative. We now know that
Right.
the flow of current is electrons, which is negative to positive. That's the way it really works. But in the days that must have been something very similar. And I'm guessing that the people you were trying to show your new theories to, Scott, didn't want to look stupid or didn't want to appear stupid to you. So what they tend to do, and I've seen this in many other situations, is if somebody doesn't understand what you're talking about fully, they either dismiss you or they sit there taking the mickey out of you to all their colleagues around them. And
Yeah.
I'll give you this is a good on you from me for you progressing this further and actually coming up with something that makes sense.
Let me add this because it's important. Philosophers like David Hume back, centuries ago would say this: absolute truth is not what science does. Religion and other modes of thinking are about absolute truth. Science does something called theory, which is a story that defines, explains, predicts, and if prediction is good enough, you can possibly control it, depending on that. So thinking about that, Martin, that flip on positive, negative, it isn't whether that's true, but what more accurately describes the phenomenon. And that's the nuance that Scott ran into with all of the reactions. And yet I would say, I've said this to Scott before, I believe in all likelihood, Peter Wilson's work got left behind for a couple of reasons. It was outside the reigning paradigm. So journal editors, I've been one in my discipline on 2 journals and founded 2 other journals. So I've been on that side of the desk.
The thing that mattered more, and thanks, we're getting more into our conversation now. So that was also the dawn of high-end computing, right?
Yes. And so you were able to do something, one, I talked about whether science is true or not. It's not. It's about theory, and so that was kind of the boundary maintenance. And Wilson's work was kind of didn't go anywhere in terms of history because journal editors probably didn't like it, reviewers didn't like it. And number 2, to do this work, you really need grant funding and contract work. And so if it's not conducive to reviewers at a journal, guess who reviews your proposals? I've been on NSF panels. I've managed panels at the Department of Agriculture. I've been around that table. My job was to make reviewers play fair. Here's a newsflash. They don't. They absolutely have to have a referee because they won't play fair. They'll express their own interest in the science. So, Scott, back to you. But that was the point I wanted to make about why Wilson's work was forgotten. And you guys resurrected it. And it was also part of the battle that you were facing until you actually outdid them, because you got every freaking solar plate you could get. And then here.
Yeah, well, that's it. Well, we did some more digging, right? Maybe about a couple of years later. So we digged around. So I spent about the next 3 or 4 years pulling material from the original science paper, right? This 5-page paper was incredibly dense. It's probably like a neutron star, right? There was so many things in it, and I've spent the next few years just pulling things out and looking at them. Then I got kind of distracted by the fact that these big bands also were doing, so these big Heil cycle bands were also performing gymnastics, just like the global weather systems on Earth. And so we get sucked into this track looking at these things called Rossby waves. So like the jet stream and the Gulf Stream are examples of Rossby waves on our planet, and they dictate global scale weather. Well, shock horror that, the sun has the same kind of patterns. So we get sucked down a black hole there. No pun intended, given today's press release on the black hole thing. But, we came back to this work when a colleague of mine was getting curious about the Terminator event itself. And we started going, so how, in the original paper, if you read the paper that appeared in 2014, we talk about this transition between the death of one Heil cycle and the blooming of the sunspot cycle on the next Heil cycle has taken place within, I think the quote is within a solar rotation, right? So 28 days. And for those of you think about an object the size of the sun, that's staggeringly fast that it goes through a transition like that. And turns out that this is what the core issue, I think, with the kind of prevailing wisdom, guys, is that to undergo a transition like that and for information to be carried inside the star on a time scale of about 28 days, things roaring hundreds of thousands of kilometers and miles in literally days, like massive signals being sent, really limits the kind of physics that's going on, right? And in the old models, these old models that house the present paradigm of how the sunspot cycle forms, they're far more gradual than that. There's nothing abrupt in that world, right? Nothing. It's very diffusive and slow. And what we're talking about something basically a tidal wave, and one of my colleagues described it exactly as such, as a tsunami that radiates outward from the equator to the mid latitudes and then up to the poles in almost no time, right? So we started digging into the Terminator events, and I found some old work in the early 1900s, one from a group at Kew Observatory and another from a group at Archetri Observatory, and they'd been analysing. So one paper, I think the English one was from 1903, and the Italian one was from 1933, but they both reached the same kind of conclusions, clearly unaware of each other's work, that they were seeing the same pattern. So we had the same pattern that went back to 1860. And so in 1860, I can't remember exactly which year it was, but that was the dawn of imaging, taking photographic plates through telescopes in the hydrogen-Balmer alpha line, so H-alpha, right? And so they got this new toy. It's like our 4K cameras, and they started taking plates every day. And they started characterizing the features that they found, and they were focused largely on sunspots, plages, so these areas that we now know are intense magnetic fields, but not intense enough to make sunspots. And these other features called filaments and prominences, right? So these are the dark features. When you look at the H-alpha sun and you see these squiggly snakes, those are on the sun's disk. They're called filaments. And above the limb, they're called prominences because they're prominent. Remember what I said earlier about solar physicists? Anyway, and so these guys in 1903 and then 1933 started cataloging and plotting the latitudes of these things. And we actually started reversing. So we started in the present day and worked backwards through about 7 or 8 other observatories, and eventually linked back up to the tables that were presented in these 2 century-old papers. And that gave us this excessively long look now. So instead of just having a few cycles, we now had 14 to look at. And we started looking at the Terminator events in each of these data sets and in detail. And it wasn't just a rotation that this was happening over. It was happening on a timescale of a few days, right? A few terrestrial days. The sun was undergoing this, its own internal paradigm shift between these Heil cycles. They would just fade out on one day, and the next cycle would be booming from rotations thereafter. And so that kind of, it's funny because that, the sound speed in air travels at a given speed. Light, we know, travels many, many thousands of times faster. But that's the way information's carried in our atmosphere, right? So sound travels at one speed, light travels at another. You stand 100 yards away from someone and you see them clapping. You see them clapping long before you hear them clapping. And so this is where we're at with terminators. And so what we started looking at was the timing of these termination events. So when it appeared at the equator and when we saw the signal at high latitudes, and it was really only a few days. And so what kind of physics can help you understand that, right? So, we quickly eliminated convection or sound waves because that would take hundreds of days or longer to carry information from the equator to mid-latitudes. We thought there was these class of magnetic waves that we call Alfvén waves after the Nobel Prize winning physicist Hans Alfvén, and it turns out that Alfvén waves could do the trick. They could carry your information as fast as we observe it, but the magnetic fields involved would have to be humongous, right? Probably an order of magnitude or two greater than the magnetic fields that we perceive to be on the inside of the sun. And then we've got the third one, which would be a form of gravity wave. Now, if you live close to mountains, you're used to seeing internal gravity waves because they form ripple patterns in the clouds. For most of you in the UK, that won't be seen. But if you live near the Rocky Mountains like I do, it's a common daily occurrence to see these kind of buoyancy waves in the atmosphere. And it turned out that kind of in a Goldilocks kind of way, that those waves could pretty much put a tail on the donkey and say, oh, well, it looks like the information from the Terminator event, the death of the Heil cycle at the equator, travels to the mid-latitudes on the timescale commensurate with what internal gravity wave would take to get there. Just as a matter of interest, remember how I was talking about the Earth's atmosphere? Well, the large-scale circulation patterns in the Earth's atmosphere also communicate to each other through internal gravity waves. So there's another one of these weather-type analogies. So that led us to another set of battles, right? So we wrote a paper. Now with my colleagues are very eminent in the world of Dynamo Theory, the theory of how sunspot cycles arise. And they were just confounded, or completely befuddled by this series of events that happened so fast that it's kind of out with the realm of their model. So it started another 2.5 years of uphill scrambling and battling with reviewers about these events that can't exist, right? So these events were not found by Messrs. Wilson and Co. Right? I've talked to many of them in passing, and they completely missed it.
Let me just add this, it might give you a catch up. You had mentioned earlier the difference between Wilson's era of his work and yours, and I had mentioned this, I think, in our paper and in our discussions. It's not uncommon whatsoever for any science, at least that uses statistics, to aggregate data to get a higher resolution, if you will, or more reliability in what they're observing. And that's common and continues. But as you get the ability to have more granular data and you have the computing capacity to manage that data, particularly when it's large, then you're able to get finer estimates. And one of the things that I think plagued Wilson versus was an advantage for where the Macintosh team is much greater computing power and much better disk storage. I remember when I got a grant to buy a big computer the size of a freezer you could walk in, a Sun Microsystems 690 multiprocessor with, I got multiple huge 669 megabyte hard drives. That was back in the late 90s, and that was a big thing, and I did data viz with that. Today, a PC would go further than that in terms of capacity by orders of magnitude. So one of the advantages that Macintosh has had in pulling a lot of this data together is simply much bigger, better, faster computing capability.
Right. No, and also, Frank, in terms of the field itself, that new sparkly toy, that big supercomputer, was a draw for everything, right? The birth of software engineers and building codes and everything required a super sophisticated code. And I think Wilson's work was also the victim of the growing paradigm of numerical modeling. And, it added almost too many variables to the mix. One of the things that was very fashionable at the time was what we called axisymmetric symmetrization. So you weren't even modeling the two hemispheres of the sun, which we know are coupled but roughly independent, they were actually just modeling a quadrant of the sun. So everything was symmetrized to try and pull this out. Now, one of the things that we found in our work was that one of the telltale things that helped us was massive asymmetry, because those of you that are scholars of solar activity know that cycle 24 was very highly asymmetric. And because we were analyzing these patterns in the data, actually the hemispheric asymmetry helped us lock in on what was kind of going on, and actually found out that asymmetry and imbalances are actually the key to the whole puzzle. It shouldn't really, if the sun was fully symmetric and the Heil cycles behaved, all we would ever have is a very boring, constantly repeating itself sunspot cycle. It would be like a metronome at 11.86 years or something like that. So,
and it's important to understand some of that, because the technology that we have, in addition to the observational capacity that's much better and getting better every day almost, and thanks largely to the work of people like Scott's organization and others, it's important to really hear that, because we in amateur radio, no matter what our education background is, we tend to worship at the holy grail of the traditional sunspot cycle sine wave paradigm, and it's all going to be that. And look, on QRZ, Nathan W1YW got a PhD, teaches or taught mathematics, contributed to the development of fractal antennas and all that good stuff, posted a QRZ thing that says, here's my prediction of cycle 25. And basically what he had done is copied a sine wave from the previous cycle 24 and pasted it on there, without any explanation. Now, that's not from someone who, shall we say, is not familiar with numbers. He teaches or taught mathematics. But it's the effect of the paradigm in training you to not look for alternatives. And so it's not about how smart you are. And it's also not about how can you tweak a curve-fitting algorithm to fit historical sunspot data. That's another dance. Scott, you can comment on this when I'm finished. That's another dance that especially hams who learned fast Fourier transforms and just never got over it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, absolutely, Frank. It kind of comes back to Martin's point earlier, that one of the things we found when we were digging into these time series is that, really an FFT is really a very inappropriate tool for analyzing this data, right? Because what we found out was that the phase of the signal was evolving in time. And if you want to really look at the physical underpinnings of something, right, whether it's a sunspot cycle or an EKG or whatever, the phase, to use a Fourier transform properly, the phase has to be steady in time. And so we had to use a different kind of tool to analyze this stuff. So we dug out the old Hilbert transform, right? And it was actually the Hilbert transform itself that provided another one of these keys to help unlock the puzzle of the terminators, and to understand how the terminator timing, or the amount of overlap between, we've used the terminator timing as a proxy for the overlap between the Heil cycles, and how that terminator timing related to the sunspot amplitude that Frank discussed earlier, right? So, just using Fourier transform blindly, that's great. You're going to get something that's really smooth. You're going to pick up a lot of the key periodicities, but it's really not capturing that phase variability that's probably introduced as a large part resulting from the interference of the Heil cycles itself.
And this is one. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it comes back to this whole thing that the sunspot cycle is the product of an interference pattern, right? And that sunspot minimum is the interference of 4 bat, right? So it's not a simple analog signal, right? It's the beating of multiple sets of drums that you're hearing. But if you use the kind of a priori assumption that it's one, you get an outcome, but it's not the right outcome, right? And so that's kind of where we're at. We're talking about apples and oranges, or maybe pears. I don't know, but
we have a hard time thinking, we out in amateur radio particularly, I think anytime you're not in a cognate area, but you're a consumer of the knowledge that emanates from that cognate area, and certainly amateur radio operators, no matter whether they're highly trained or skilled, or they're just more or less pedestrian, I read this in a book, type of thing. We tend to want to make it a binary solution. Okay, it is or it isn't. Do I buy this radio? Do I not buy this radio? Is the sunspot cycle this time going to be big or not? Yet, what Scott is telling us, it's a multiple variable problem. You go to a doctor, can you cut me? Can you give me a pill? Can you give me a shot? Yes or no? And the doctor says, well, you've got three things wrong with you, and they work on each other. So let's deal with them in this order. And you're frustrated because you don't have that sort of magic solution. And that's part of what Scott's saying, and we don't deal with that very well. So we've got some learning to do, assuming that the forecast solves the anomalies as it looks like it is. So, Martin, there's some learning. I've spent about a year, I think now, Scott, reading all your work and your team's work and trying to make sense of it. Yeah. It's outside my field of science, but the data analytic part, I can learn and I read and look up stuff. So it takes a bit, if you're not a solar physicist with an open mind, to catch on and learn it. I'm delighted that Scott will be the banquet speaker for the Flex Radio Systems banquet at Hamvention. So he'll talk a bit about what we're talking about today. And we've got some learning to do, Martin.
We certainly have, Frank. We certainly have. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed today. I've kept yourself and Scott on for well over an hour, or coming up for an hour, and it's been totally fascinating to me. I try and have an open mind about most things, so and that's been good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to suggest we draw the line under at this point in time, and maybe get Scott and yourself back again at another point in time, a bit further into the cycle, if there are new developments. How do you think about that, Scott?
Yeah, it'd be great. I mean, we have a few landmarks that are upcoming that will be good to test them, right? So I think that we're looking at a Sunspot Max of around 2024. We should be some nice, consistently high solar radio flux, so the ionosphere should be bouncing. Our projection is that the cycle at this point is looking like it'll be at least twice as big as cycle 24. So, I'm saying this on your podcast, and it'll be interesting to see over the coming months and years as how that bears out.
Now, Martin, Scott's a little nervous because he knows that I remember a promise I extracted from him on that original interview. And being from Scotland and being a man of honor and grace, I know he has some Scottish kilts there. So when his team declares victory, I sort of put him in a bad spot. I asked him to send me a video of him dancing a princely jig out in a meadow in beautiful Colorado. I won't hold him to that for reasons that I share. If I owned kilts myself, I would no longer be able to fit in them. So, but we will celebrate if all that holds out. I certainly look forward to it.
I think we will. Now, just as we're closing up, Scott, if somebody wanted to contact you, do you have an email address you wish to publish?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I fielded a lot of questions. My personal email I won't give you, but I'll give you my work email, which is mscott, so mscott @ucar.edu.
Oh, that's good. That's good, because sometimes you may get people that want to follow up outside.
Yeah, no, I welcome that, and if people want to follow where we're at, we're actually pretty visible on Twitter, and you can follow me at at SW Macintosh, so SWMCINTOSH on Twitter, and we have a fair amount of trolling going on and some fun and games looking at this data and present kind of regular updates on things. So if folks want to follow, that is one place to do it, in addition to the Helio Forecast website that Frank discussed earlier.
Oh, that's good news. That's good news. So, Frank, I should know your email address off by heart. Or
yes, it's just K4FMH at ARRL.net. And as I like to say, I'm good on QRZ. So you can always find me with my call sign K4FMH.
Hey, that's bragging, saying you're good on QRZ.
Well, they actually have a sticker that they want you to use to say I'm good on the Z. So,
all right, no problems. Well, listen, I'd like to thank the pair of you for joining me today, and yeah, you've blown my mind a bit, but I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So, thank you very much, guys, and let's have a look in 2024. We're at the top of the Sunspot cycle.
Looking forward to it, Martin. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Martin. Bye. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you.
If you'd like to support the show, please go to icqpodcast.com/donate.
Well, many thanks there, Dad, for your very engaging feature there that say you worked on. And I think you're right in what you mentioned at the start of the show. It certainly is a feature that requires listening to potentially more than once, just to get our heads around exactly the topics and the thoughts that are discussed throughout the feature. So feel free, guys, to pull out your phones or your playback devices and rewind. And as I certainly give it a listen to again when you've got the time, because I think, as I listen to it for a couple of times is well worth doing, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I'm more than willing to say that listening to it many times is interesting, because when they're more in depth, it's easy to miss the odd little thing. But yeah, I'd say it's a great one, Colin.
Cool. Well, say the other great thing, of course, we've been up to over the last few days is last weekend's ICQ podcast digital group open day, for want of a better term. I say that, and we had lots of listeners come and join us throughout the day, and they dipped in and out, etc. And certainly always seemed to be a good steady stream of people around. There was even times I could even break into the conversation, was lurking away nicely in the background. But it was great to have quite a few listeners tip up for the day, and certainly was an enjoyable day. Wouldn't you agree?
I would. The ICQ Digital Voice Activity Day, I think, was a success. I would have liked, obviously, more people to come on, but we can't win everything. But, as Colin said, there was a lot of discussions. This wasn't just to log into a net and disappear. So those of you who may have thought, oh, he's just going to want my call sign, stick it in the log and he'll move to the next person, I'm not going to bother to turn up. You missed out. In fairness, there was a lot of nice discussion going on, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I must admit, though, Colin, after 12 hours on air, I was absolutely wrecked. But in fairness, I enjoyed it. I've spoken to a number of people afterwards that have asked me when it's going to happen again. And I've said, yeah, we'll do it probably in another couple of months. Don't want to do it too many times or too often, because it loses its fun. And one thing you ought to be aware of, and I mentioned this at the end of my closing up of what I've been up to, but there are a couple of repeaters now in the UK that you might actually hear people on the ICQ podcast talk group, because the repeater keepers are listeners. And, at least one repeater this time was permanently linked to the ICQ podcast group. So I'm sure the other repeater keeper I spoke to will probably have one of his repeaters connected next time we do it. So, word's getting out there, Colin. Things are expanding. And all in all, a very good day on my part.
Yeah, fantastic. And not only that as well, but we're still working on the actual infrastructure of the digital group as well to continue to make improvements there, etc. So there's a lot going on that area, and the best thing I can suggest anyone does is, if you're interested, is to visit icqpodcast.com and go to the digital group section on the website, and you can find out about how you can get involved in that section there. Well, what we're just left to do is to thank our monthly and annual subscription donors for this episode, for helping us out, paying our way, etc., and keeping us on the air. As always, we'd like you to consider if you found any value from your show that you've listened to today. And if you have, what we would like you to do is to visit icqpodcast.com/donate and send us a donation or whatever value that you found in the show. Pop over our way, and we'll put that towards what we do and our running costs, etc. And that would all be greatly appreciated. So thank you for considering us and the value you get from the show. And also, we need to thank the guys that joined us in the news roundtable as well, and that is Frank Kilo 4 Foxtrot Mike Hotel, Edmund Mike 0 Mike November Golf, and Ed DD5 Lima Papa. So thanks for joining us in the news roundtable there. Well, as always, there's only one last thing to do when we record these shows, and thank Mrs. B for giving us a period of time where she downs tools to let us record, this section, and bid her and yourself a great weekend, and more importantly, a sit-down cup of tea, and maybe a nice chocolate biscuit or two just to relax after finishing off the show.
Yeah, we will. Well, certainly will. Mrs. B's within earshot, so we'll have a few cups of tea today, obviously, and I'll find your mum a nice chocolate bicky at some point in time. And it's sunny outside, so I think we'll probably be out in our back garden, or what our American cousins call the backyard. So that's what I'm up to, Colin.
That's wonderful. Well, I bid you 73s, and 73s to our listeners. And as always, we'll catch up with everyone in a fortnight's time. 73s all.
Yeah, 73.